Hello. So I want to talk a little bit about my opinion about some of the scientists claiming that God is no longer required, that science has invalidated the concept of God. Um, I want to put out my thoughts on this statement and see if I can get some feedback down in the comments. I could be wrong. I could be right. I do have a pretty good scientific background. My background is in applied math and physics. Um, and when I listen to these comments, they don't really make a whole lot of sense to me. It almost seems like the person who's saying them is ignorant in a way. And anyway, so please comment below. The easiest way to invalidate the statement that science disproves God, the easiest way to disprove that is to create a scenario in which all of science holds as valid, yet requires one. And at that point, it becomes impossible to distinguish which scenario is correct. Does science require God, or does science refute God? So, in our discussion, I'm going to I want to talk about just to create a general background of some of the leading theories in science. I want to talk a little bit about the creation of the universe. The leading theory in science for the creation of the universe states that everything that is in the known universe was at one point at what's called a singularity. It was in the form of energy, and it was all at a point of infinite density. And some unknown process, typically considered a quantum mechanical process, fluctuation, some unknown process caused this energy to expand. And as it would expand, it began to cool. And it cooled sufficiently first to allow particles to form, and then finally it allowed for protons and the hydrogen atom to begin to form. For the sake of our discussion, although it's not entirely correct, let's think about this as a cloud of hydrogen atoms. So this big cloud of hydrogen atoms is expanding, and there are regions within this huge cloud that are more dense than others. And so gravity tends to bring those regions of higher density together, and as they're expanding, those tend to break apart and go off on their own. And these form what are called our galaxies. So these regions that have broken off, these regions of higher density that have broken off, are forming what we call our galaxies. Now, within each one of these galaxies, the same process kind of repeats. There are certain regions that have a higher density than in others. And so what happens is within these smaller regions of higher density, gravity starts to pull those smaller regions within themselves together. And what it does is it heats up the core sufficiently to where the individual hydrogen atoms have enough kinetic energy that when they hit they stick together. This is known as fusion. And what's interesting is the individual masses of the hydrogen atoms is greater than the combined mass in the form of helium. And that little bit of mass, about 1%, is converted into energy, according to Einstein's theory, E equals mc squared. And that little bit of energy is shown as heat, radiates as heat, and it pushes back and counteracts the pull of gravity. And the point where the pull of gravity and this fusion pushing back, the point where those two are equal, where those two forces are equal, that determines the radius of this star. And so within each galaxy, you have billions of stars, and within our universe, you have billions of galaxies, all forming simultaneously. Once the star has exhausted all of the hydrogen within its core, it then begins to fuse together heavier elements. And when it gets to where it's trying to fuse iron, it cannot do it. And so what happens is the star is no longer able to counteract the pull of gravity. And so what happens is the star begins to collapse on itself. Now, if the star is sufficiently large, many times the size of our sun, what happens is the gravitational field is so strong that it forces electrons into protons, overcoming the electron degeneracy pressure. And what happens is you get a very large explosion called a supernova. And this supernova throws out all of the heavy elements that the star has produced, throws those out into space. And so this is where our heavy elements come from. Everything was at one point inside of a star. Now, our solar system was created in a very similar way. We had a dust cloud, and within that dust cloud there was mostly your hydrogen dust, and mixed in with it were some of the heavy elements produced by supernova. And as the core of this dust cloud began to heat up, it formed a star, and the radiation pressure from that star began to push away the lighter dust particles. And those lighter dust particles moved out of our solar system and help form what's called our Oort cloud. Now, the sun the radiation pressure was not enough to push the heavy elements, the rocks that were orbiting this sun. The radiation pressure was not enough to push that away. And so over millions of years, those rocks began to gather together, forming our planets. So now that we have a little bit better understanding of how the universe was, how it evolved, I want to talk a little bit about our physical laws. We know that everything, except for perhaps living beings, behave in a very deterministic way. We can apply our physical laws to look at what the condition was at a previous date and at a later date. As an example, if I am driving 60 miles an hour down the highway, I know that in 60 minutes time that I will have traveled 60 miles. And I know this by applying the very simple law, distance equals rate times time. In a very similar manner, I can apply a much more complicated law called general relativity that tells us the behavior and the movement and the motion of large objects. So I can look up into space and I can say, okay, there's a planet here, there's a star here, there's a galaxy here, and they're moving at this speed in relation to each other and in this direction, in a particular direction. And so I can apply our laws and calculate where those objects would have moved to at a later date. I can also do so and look at where they were at a previous time. So everything behaves in a very deterministic way. What's interesting about this is that it opens up the possibility of creating, not by using a hammer and nails like a construction worker, but creating by the assignment of law. So the Bible states that God is exceedingly intelligent, uncomprehendibly intelligent. And so would an intelligent being sit there and try and put stars together one by one, or would he work in a much more intelligent way that allows everything to naturally create itself? So as an example, suppose that I were substantially more intelligent and I had these materials that I could assign a law to. I could assign a law to these materials and let them evolve according to those laws to produce something. And if I were more intelligent, I could know which laws I needed to assign to produce a desired outcome. So if I wanted to identically create this universe, I might assign the identical laws that we have in this universe. This tells us that by looking out into space and saying, okay, everything evolves according to law, there is no need for God because everything evolves according to these rules. To me, that is an entirely ignorant statement to make, because we don't know where those laws came from. So when we can determine who or what is responsible for those laws, then we can make an argument. Then we have a logical concept to base that statement on. But at this point, simply looking out into space and saying, okay, everything evolves according to laws, therefore no God, is a very ignorant statement. And in fact, to me, I'm kind of embarrassed that our scientists don't understand that. That's a little embarrassing to me. Lawrence Krauss, that's Stephen Hawking, Richard Dawkins. That just doesn't even make sense. But anyway, so the next topic that I want to discuss is life. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the creation of life, according to what science claims. And to do so, I want to make a hypothetical cell. Let's say that I have a bag, okay, representing this cell, and in the cell is a little bit of fluid. And there's a button on the wall of that cell, and I'm going to put a particle A inside the fluid. And when particle A randomly hits that button, it turns an LED on. Stupid, I know, but concept-wise. Now, the more A's I put into the bag, the more probability of one of them hitting that button. And so the more frequent that light turns on. The fewer A's I have in the bag, the less likely, the lower the frequency. So I can control the frequency of how often this light turns on simply by controlling the concentration of A in the bag. Very similar to how a cell works. A cell works based on concentrations and probabilities. What's the probability of this particle or of this protein matching with this? Another example, suppose that I want to make this bag, this cell, this hypothetical cell move. Well, I could attach a motor to it. Now, if I wanted it to move in response to, say, a stimuli of receiving some light, what I could do is I could attach a solar panel to that motor, and through no conscious process, no free will, no thinking, when light hits that solar panel, the cell moves. Notice that none of these processes require free will. They don't allow for free will. Particles A can't randomly choose to hit the button. The cell can't randomly choose to move. It only behaves as required by the system that is responsible for the stimuli that it's receiving. So no light, no movement. If there is light, there is movement. Now, I can keep building processes into this cell that allow this cell to respond to seemingly infinite number of stimuli. I can make it respond to temperature. I can make it sense food. I can make it do all these things, but it never freely chooses to respond. All it does is it reacts according to the system requirements, the requirements of the system that are responsible for sensing that stimuli. what's interesting is that a cell being able to divide and multiply, the same thing can be said for that. It is simply a reaction, a response to a stimuli, and there is no thought process, there is no free will, there is no thinking. These are just machines that follow natural processes. We've been raised since we were a kid thinking that, okay, cells are living and cells have life and all this stuff. But when you really think about it, there is nothing in that cell. It moves and all this stuff, just like a robot moves. But there's nothing in that cell that exhibits the same properties as a human being or an animal. It doesn't exhibit free will. So if I put a bunch of these cells together to create an organism, why would that organism have free will? What I'm trying to get at is simply putting a body together, say a human body or an animal body, does not give that body free will. Yes, that body can respond just like a robot can respond, but I don't think that you ever get all of the properties that a living being exhibits. I think that there's something else that makes us living, and that something else is God. Science will never get to it. It will come close, but it will never create life. So I want to expand on that just a little bit. The scientific definition of life can actually be satisfied by, in a crude sense, by certain robotics. So, for example, we're able to create robotics that sense out an energy source. We're able to create robotics that manufacture copies of themselves. We're able to create these robots that satisfy each of the scientific definition of life. And when we think about it, if I make a robot that replicates itself, that searches out power, that satisfies all these scientific definitions, I still am not left with something that exhibits free will or anything that resembles what a human being or animal exhibits. For example, I can create a robot that goes for a run with me. I can create a robot that cooks me dinner. But that robot will always be forced to do exactly what its code requires. Scientists can yank out the DNA in a cell and slap in a new DNA that they've created, and that cell will automatically begin to perform different functions based on the DNA, the instructions, the coding that it just received. This tells us that that cell does not have free will. It is simply following perfectly the code that it is required to follow. There's no free will. What's interesting to me is that the Bible introduces this new substance, this new material, and it calls it a spirit. And so if a spirit is constructed of something, some form of material, and that material is not bound by our laws, meaning that it isn't required to abide by our physical laws. Gravity doesn't affect it. Magnetism doesn't affect it. All these laws that we feel in our universe doesn't affect the spiritual side of us. If that's the case, then a spirit would be able to have free will. If it's not required to follow any law, then it could have free will. And so, in my opinion, since we can never obtain all the properties that we have as living beings just by putting materials together, in my opinion, we have to have something that is not bound by our laws, something like a soul that allows us to freely choose and that runs this machine, this body. Scientists will tell you, a lot of them will, that we don't have free will, that the mind tricks you into believing free will. They will also tell you that consciousness evolved over time. And when you think about it, if there is no free will, then there isn't any evolutionary advantage to consciousness. So if I'm not able to change my actions one way or another, then it doesn't matter. My survival doesn't matter on me being conscious or unconscious. It just doesn't quite add up. And so basically my argument states that everything within science holds as valid. The creation of the universe, the creation of the human body through evolution. God formed man of the dust of the earth. I believe that to be evolution through natural processes. And then it says that he breathed into him the breath of life. So once man was formed, he gave him life. And what's interesting is that this concept fits perfectly within the confines of every scientific theory. And it seems to answer questions that science, not that science hasn't answered yet, but it seems to answer questions that science cannot answer. In other words, it's somewhat outside of the realm of science. So, in my opinion, everything within science is valid. The evolution of the universe, the evolution of the body, all of these are valid. What aren't valid are the things in science that we have to assume just to begin these two processes. So we have to assume that laws existed before the universe, or that God doesn't exist. And that is an assumption. There is nothing that says that. All we can say is, okay, the universe evolved according to these laws. We can't say what set it in motion. Okay? Likewise, the human body, the body evolved according to physical laws. We cannot, through science, say, okay, this process happened and gave it life. Those two limitations are things that science, in my opinion, will never resolve. You are forced to look to God. There is no other way to resolve those two issues with absolute certainty. And so what's interesting to me is that if God created this universe by assigning our physical laws to all of these materials in such a way that they evolved through natural processes to create this universe and this world and this body as we see today, then what is a miracle? A miracle all of a sudden becomes very realistic, very possible, because if God is capable of assigning laws to materials, then a miracle is simply assigning a law to a material. I have a broken ear. I assign some law that fixes that ear, and voila. It doesn't seem so complicated, so difficult anymore. It's just an assignment of law. So, Jesus turning water into wine and walking on water and all this stuff, that is simply an assignment of law. So my implications are that God created the universe exactly as science requires. So God assigned laws, and the universe evolved according to those laws to create the universe that we see today. The human body, all the living beings evolved according to those physical laws. And so when you take this thought process, you realize that since everything in science depends on these laws, depends on the evidence that shows up because of these laws, when you think about God as being the assigner of these physical laws, you realize that it is impossible for any scientific evidence to disagree with the concept of God creating the universe. In other words, it is impossible for there to be scientific evidence that disagrees with the concept of God creating the universe. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about what evidence is. Evidence, for me, evidence is something that I can personally verify. So, as a mathematician and background in physics, I consider evidence things that I can calculate. So I can calculate somewhat the evolution of the universe. I can calculate how the solar system might have evolved. I can calculate these things. So for myself, I can personally verify that. I cannot personally verify transitional fossils, although I do believe. But I cannot personally go and test the DNA and find out for myself with absolute certainty that transitional fossils exist. I have to take somebody's word. I have to take a very credible person's word, but nonetheless, I have to take somebody's word. Likewise, in the Bible, there are testimonies and written documentation of events. And I have to take those people's word and either accept it as true or accept it as false. But in both cases, I have to take it somewhat on faith. And I know the scientific community won't like me using that word, but that is the only situation that it could be. I have to at some point take some of this on faith. I don't know with absolute certainty that transitional fossils exist, although I do believe that they do. One of the most interesting arguments that I've heard to kind of help science is by stating that emotions are caused by chemical reactions in the body. And what's interesting to me is that, in all my chemistry classes, I've never once seen a chemical reaction cause emotion. In other words, chemicals on inanimate materials do not create emotions. Okay, chemical reactions might take place within the body while you're feeling certain emotions, but that does not imply that your body feels emotions simply because of these chemical reactions. I think a better solution would be that these chemicals act on something like a spirit that allows that spirit to feel emotion. Anyways, that's just my thought. That's something that seems to make a lot more sense than chemical reactions causing emotions. What are they causing emotions on? So the implications here are that God created the universe by assigning physical laws that allow it to evolve exactly as science requires into what we see today. These physical laws also allow the living beings to, the bodies to evolve as evolution requires, according to these physical laws, into the bodies that we see today. But those bodies are not themselves living. There is something that same being gave that allows for life. And most people call that a soul or a spirit. What's interesting to me is that the realm of science seems to kind of be a subset, a smaller group of all the evidence that that we have. Let me clarify what that means. So science is something that, in order to be science, you have to be able to test it. You have to be able to repeat it, and have a variety of people verify that it's true, all this stuff. What happens to events that we cannot test? So there may be a one-time event where all you have are eyewitnesses. At that point, technically, it is not science because it is not reproducible. And so all the evidence that we have, all the science that we have is actually a smaller group than all the evidence that we have. It's kind of a rough way of saying it, but I think I've made the point clear. I'm going to go off on a little bit of an interesting topic that doesn't really have anything to do with science. It's mostly people's personal experiences. Somebody who dies and experiences things. Science claims that they have an answer, that is just hallucinations taking place. I don't have a whole lot of feedback on that. But what about situations where people communicate with the dead or have experiences with the dead? Without naming names, I know people that are in the medical industry that have many accounts of seeing apparitions, only to go into a room and find that person had just recently become deceased. People communicating with former loved ones and claiming that they can't die yet, but they'll die in a couple days, and stating the day, and sure enough, they die on that day. These are things that science can't really put any insight on, but fit very well with the concept of creationism. Science would have to deny that. Science would have to say, okay, no, that doesn't exist. But we're fairly certain that it does because of people's experiences, people that we might be close to. And so those experiences, although a lot of them probably are false, a lot of them probably are made up, those experiences tend to also push us to creationism rather than just science. So science is perfectly valid, but it's not the whole picture. The whole picture is creationism. So I want to talk a little bit about where did God come from? And to do so, I want to take an example here. I want to take some of the mass that's in our universe. Let's say this Earth. Okay, the materials that this Earth is made of, can either have always existed, whether it was in the form of energy or mass. Those materials could have either always existed or they were created. If they were created, then we have an uphill battle of saying, what were they created from? What caused them to be created? What created those materials in the first place? And that's an uphill battle that science doesn't even want to attack. Okay? So the easiest approach is to say that those materials have always existed and that they simply change form. Energy to mass, mass to energy. So if those materials can always exist, why can't God always exist? There isn't any logic that says, okay, God can't exist, but these materials can. Some will argue that everything came into existence during the Big Bang. And what's interesting about that is if we're going to use quantum mechanics to predict how this singularity, the universe as a singularity, began, then before it can begin, our known laws have to apply, meaning that we have to have space and time and energy and all the requirements that are needed for our physical laws to hold. So those had to first apply. So we can't have a universe that explodes to create the laws that allow it to create itself. We have to have the physical laws that are first given, that allow the universe to then evolve according to those laws. And that's, in my opinion, what science misses. And like Lawrence Krauss, he says everything came from nothing. And that the physical laws, the universe created itself and then gave itself laws to create itself. And to me, that is the silliest thing. I'm just going to stop talking about that. To me, the more intelligent thought process is that those laws were given. And that is what allowed the universe to evolve into what we see today. I guess what I'm trying to say is that science wants to claim that some things are eternal, but won't admit that God can be eternal.